Some silences don't come from peace. They come from being measured, doubted, and quietly dismissed in places you've worked your whole life to belong. She stood there, polished, poised, but inside, something cracked. Not loud enough for the room to hear, just enough for her to feel the cold weight of erasure settle in her bones. And the worst part? No one flinched. Not the woman at the counter, not the passengers behind her, not the system built to let moments like that slide through without consequence. She didn't scream. She didn't fight back the way they expected. Instead, she did what people like her have always had to. Dosha endured, and then she rewrote the ending. This isn't a story about outrage. It's a story about what happens when quiet isn't weakness, when stillness becomes strategy. And one woman decides that dignity doesn't have to make noise to dismantle everything built to ignore her. So, what really happened after Seat 1A disappeared? Let's begin. The overhead lights inside Charlotte Douglas International Airport hummed with the kind of sterile calm only airports could manufacture, too bright, too consistent, and entirely indifferent. The terminal was alive with the rhythm of movement, business shoes clicking, toddlers wailing, boarding announcements crackling through cheap speakers. In the middle of it all stood Dr. Alina Moore, polished and still, like someone misplaced in the chaos. She was elegance, subdued, dressed in a dark green wool coat that held the subtle weight of winter, her posture relaxed but alert, the kind of quiet presence that commanded respect without asking for it. The boarding pass in her hand, freshly printed in crisp, read, Gate B12, Seat 1A, First Class. Alina was no stranger to terminals. She had crossed cities and continents, spoken on ethical leadership at universities in Belgium, Nairobi, Vancouver. But this wasn't one of those days. This was supposed to be a simple flight from Charlotte to Boston, an uneventful return after delivering a keynote on institutional integrity. She had flown this route dozens of times. Nothing about it should have felt different. But it did. As she approached the counter at Gate B12, a young white woman with sleek blonde hair and a badge reading Megan Clifford, Delta Sky Access, barely looked up. She was tapping furiously on her keyboard, her lips twisted in a faint smirk that could have meant anything or nothing at all. Alina smiled gently. Good morning. Just wanted to confirm the upgrade process. I was moved into 1A last night. Megan's eyes flicked to the screen, then to Alina, then back. The pause wasn't long, but it was long enough. She gave a thin chuckle, barely a sound, and said, Huh, that's odd. Her fingers moved swiftly, almost theatrically, across the keys. There seems to have been a reassignment, she added. You're now in 33. F. That's window seat. Economy. The words landed not like a bomb, but like a whisper, meant to humiliate. Alina blinked slowly. I'm sorry. I booked this flight months ago, and the upgrade was confirmed. Megan didn't look up. Yeah, sometimes the system autocorrects based on loyalty status or ticket class. It happens more often than you'd think. Behind her, a man in khakis and earbuds tapped his foot, impatient. A couple with a stroller gave Alina a sideways glance, as if she were the problem. The line was growing, but no one said anything. The boarding pass slid back across the counter. Have a good flight, Megan said, her smile tight. Next, please. Alina didn't move. Not at first. She felt her hands grow cold, not from anger, not yet, but from that creeping, familiar weight that wasn't new but never dulled. The precise, practiced way some people chose to tell you that you didn't belong. She stepped aside, eyes scanning the gate area. It wasn't just the reassignment. It was the way Megan never once asked a question or offered a solution. The way she laughed. The way others in the Delta uniforms nearby had watched and said nothing. She stood there a moment longer, as if deciding whether or not this was the battle worth choosing. Her phone buzzed in her coat pocket. A message from her husband, Jordan Moore. Just landed back in Atlanta. Call me when you're boarded. Love you. She didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, she walked toward the row of molded plastic chairs by the window and sat, her back straight, her suitcase perfectly aligned at her feet. The overhead screen flickered above. Now boarding group A. She watched Megan laugh at something with another agent. The way their bodies leaned in close, conspiratorial. She couldn't hear the words, but she knew the rhythm. She had lived this rhythm her entire life. From the time she was passed over for advanced placement in high school despite her GPA, to the tenured faculty room at Emory where she was assumed to be the assistant and not the ethicist. Even in spaces built to celebrate intellect, she had often been required to shrink herself just to be left alone. And now this? A seat reassignment disguised as a system glitch? No, she knew better. There was no announcement, no alarm, just a clean, quiet erasure. Alina let her hands rest gently on her lap, fingers interlaced. She drew in a long breath and exhaled slowly. She wasn't going to make a scene. That had never been her way. But she also wasn't going to pretend nothing had happened. A young flight attendant with a high ponytail walked past, stealing a glance at Alina before quickly averting her eyes. The silence of complicity was louder than anything Alina had heard that morning. Somewhere behind her, a child shrieked. A man sneezed. The hum of engines outside the terminal was distant, but steady. The world, as it always did, continued turning. But something in her had shifted. It wasn't about first class. It never had been. It was about the quiet decision someone had made in the space of a single glance, a decision that echoed centuries of training about who belongs where and why. Her fingers reached for her phone again. She opened the secure messaging app she and Jordan used for legal coordination. She typed only one word, "Ready," and then she slipped the phone back into her pocket. Megan wouldn't remember her. Not really. To her, this was just another morning. Another minor disruption quickly resolved. A woman reassigned. A line cleared. Efficiency. But that's the thing about silence. Sometimes it is mistaken for surrender. Sometimes people confuse poise for passivity. And sometimes they never see the storm until it's already here. Dr. Alina Moore didn't cry. She never had, at least not in public spaces. The weight of tears had always felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Not as the only black woman in her graduate cohort, not as a young professor fighting for credibility, and certainly not here, in Gate 12 of Charlotte Douglas International Airport, surrounded by strangers who had already decided what she was. Difficult. Entitled. Unpleasant. The unspoken labels lingered like fog in the terminal air, visible only to those trained to recognize them. She sat still, fingers gently resting on the leather strap of her carry-on, watching the boarding groups file past. No one looked her in the eye. Not really. They glanced at her and then quickly turned away, like people do when they see someone slip but pretend not to notice, to avoid the burden of empathy. It wasn't just Megan at the counter. It was the collective hush that followed, the way the passengers behind her had sighed, the way the other agents had watched and said nothing. The way the young woman at the security kiosk, the one who had smiled at the man with the platinum card, had stiffened the moment Alina approached her earlier that morning. Each small moment stacked like bricks around her, forming a quiet cage built not with rage, but with refined restraint. She looked to her left. A mother scrolled on her phone, one hand on the stroller beside her. To her right, a businessman tapped on a MacBook, pausing only to sip his green juice. Alina was invisible here, just another woman in a sea of travelers. And yet, in her invisibility, she felt more exposed than ever. She thought of her students back at Emory, bright, challenging, full of questions they didn't yet know how to ask. She thought of how they looked at her, not just as an educator, but as proof that you could navigate a world that wasn't built for you without becoming hardened by it. What would she tell them if they saw her now? That sometimes dignity costs a seat? That sometimes silence is the only armor that fits? Her phone buzzed again. Jordan Moore, her husband, had texted again. "Just checking in. You okay?" She stared at the screen, then typed slowly, "I will be. Not ready yet." She knew Jordan would understand. He always did. His life in civil rights law had taught him how to read between silences, how to hear what wasn't said, He knew better than to ask for details. He would wait. And when she was ready, he'd be there not to fix it, but to help her build what came next. Across the terminal, Megan laughed at something on her tablet. The sound floated through the air like a pinprick. Alina turned her gaze toward a young flight attendant emerging from the jet bridge. Callie, the name tag read, in soft script. She looked barely 25, fresh-faced and tense in the way new employees always were trying hard to be both helpful and invisible. Their eyes met. For a fraction of a second, Callie hesitated. Her mouth opened slightly as if to say something, anything. But then she looked away, her pace quickening as she moved toward the service door and disappeared from view. Alina exhaled. She didn't blame her. Not really. Silence was a language that had been taught to all of them. Some learned it to survive, others to maintain comfort. And some, like Megan, wore it like a badge, the silence of selective professionalism, wielded as a shield against accountability. In the quiet that followed, Alina's thoughts wandered. She remembered being 12, standing next to her mother in a department store dressing room. A sales clerk had followed them closely, too closely, while her mother tried to find a dress for a work interview. When they left without buying anything, the clerk muttered something under her breath. Alina hadn't understood the full meaning then, but her mother had. She'd taken Alina's hand and said, quietly but firmly, "Don't you ever let anyone make you apologize for being somewhere you've earned." That memory came back now, sharper than it had been in years. Alina shifted in her seat. A man in a navy blazer walked up to the counter, flashing his diamond tier loyalty badge. Megan's smile lit up like a storefront window. "Welcome, sir. Let me see if I can move you closer to the front." Alina watched. He handed her an economy boarding pass. She handed back 2D. No fuss, no smirks, no system correction. Just an upgrade seamlessly given where hers had been seamlessly removed. She looked away. Across the terminal, a janitor swept the corners of the waiting area, humming a quiet tune under his breath. He moved without hurry, without fear of being seen. There was something peaceful about him, the kind of man who had learned how to remain whole in a world that constantly chipped away at people. She envied that. Final call for Flight 628 to Boston. The overhead voice crackled above her, emotionless and rushed. Alina rose, not because she was ready, but because she knew what had to come next. She adjusted her scarf, smoothed her coat, and walked toward the gate with the kind of measured grace that left no room for interpretation. She handed her boarding pass to a younger agent, not Megan, who scanned it quickly without making eye contact. "Have a good flight," he said automatically. Alina nodded once. As she entered the jet bridge, the cool draft rushed over her skin. Her seat 33F was at the rear of the aircraft, next to the restroom, beside a coughing man and an overhead bin already jammed with other people's baggage. She sat quietly, resting her bag between her knees. And then, slowly, deliberately, she pulled out her notebook. It was a small, leather-bound journal Jordan had given her when she first received tenure. Inside, she began writing not with fury, but with clarity. She documented everything: names, times, the tone, the sequence. She wrote about Megan's smirk, about the crowd's silence, about Callie's hesitance, about the man in the navy blazer and his effortless upgrade. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. Reality was enough. The plane began taxiing. Beside her, the man coughed again. No one apologized. No one offered her a seat swap. She was just another black woman in economy, polite, silent, invisible. But beneath that silence, something was building. Not a storm. Not yet. More like pressure beneath the surface, tectonic and certain. She thought again of her students, of her mother, of every woman who had sat quietly when she could have screamed. And then, with a small breath, she closed the notebook and slipped it back into her bag. The flight would last 2 hours. What would come after would last much longer. Because what Megan and the others didn't know, couldn't have known, was that Alina Moore was not just another passenger. She was a professor of applied ethics, a senior advisor on institutional compliance for 3 Fortune 100 companies, and the lead architect of a code of conduct adopted by 5 major airlines. She had authored the very policies that had just been ignored. And now, the silence she had endured would become the foundation of a case study, one that would reshape more than just seat assignments. One that would ask, what does it cost a system when its integrity fails in the small, quiet moments? As the wheels lifted off the runway and the cabin tilted toward the sky, Alina didn't look out the window. She didn't need the view. She had seen enough. The aircraft touched down in Boston with the kind of thud that jerked people from sleep and half-finished thoughts. Seatbelts snapped open. Phones lit up. Carry-ons were snatched from under seats like lifeboats from a sinking ship. But Dr. Alina Moore didn't move. She remained still in seat 33F, the cool air from the vent above brushing the crown of her curls. Around her, a quiet rush unfolded. Passengers muttered about connecting flights. The man beside her coughed twice more and mumbled something about the cold. No one noticed her. Not yet. The quiet in her bones had settled into something denser now, no longer anger, no longer shame. It was focus. Cold, precise focus. Her fingers reached for her phone. She opened the encrypted app Jordan had set up years ago when she began advising international ethics panels. One word. Proceeding. 2 minutes later, 3 blinking dots appeared. Then a reply. Understood. Legal prepping. Emory notified. Emphasizing pattern, not incident. You're covered. The note was brief, but it was everything. This wasn't going to be a complaint. It was going to be a case. By the time she exited the plane and stepped into the glass corridor of Logan International, the airport's sterile brightness no longer felt indifferent. It felt complicit. Everything did. The neon white lighting, the polished tiles, the impossibly clean directional signs. Each part of the system had absorbed what happened in Charlotte and remained silent. But that silence would now be dissected. Alina walked through the terminal with deliberate calm, her phone in hand, not texting, just recording. Details. Atmosphere. The rhythm of what the world looked like when you'd just been erased and no one had flinched. Outside, a car was waiting. It wasn't Jordan at this time. It was someone from her team in Boston. A driver named Yvette, soft-spoken and razor-efficient, with a graduate degree in digital forensics and a side hobby in pattern analysis. She didn't ask questions, just opened the door. "Welcome back, Dr. Moore," she said quietly. "Let's head straight to the office," Alina responded. "We'll brief Jordan on call." Inside the vehicle, the silence was comfortable, punctuated only by the soft ping of updates on Alina's secure tablet. The team had already flagged 3 additional complaints against Delta Sky Access in the past 18 months, by women of color, one by a disabled veteran. All 3 had been closed, without escalation. Alina's jaw clenched. She didn't need escalation. She needed accountability. As the car glided through the snow-lined streets of Boston, her mind clicked into place like a puzzle finishing itself. She wasn't just going to respond. She was going to redirect the system's own policies back onto its self-exposing how protocol had been used not to protect passengers, but to mask patterns. When they reached the Officer satellite base in Cambridge, it was nearly evening. The building was quiet, but inside, the hum of motion was alive. Jordan was already in the glass conference room, sleeves rolled up, laptop open. He didn't greet her with worry. He greeted her with resolve. "Legal found 5 contradictions in their boarding policies," he said, walking alongside her as they moved toward the hub. "And 2 flagged overrides from Megan's ID badge in the last 3 months," she added. They looked at each other. Jordan smiled. "Just a little. They don't know who you are yet, do they?" Alina exhaled. "They will." They didn't want a headline. They didn't want media noise. That was never Alina's style. Her strategy was more devastating. Systemic leverage. By morning, 3 ethics boards across the Northeast had received preliminary inquiries from Emory's Institutional Integrity Office regarding vendor partnerships. The ethics clause, buried deep in every memorandum of understanding, allowed Alina's team to freeze all non-essential collaboration until patterns of procedural inconsistency could be reviewed. That included Delta. That included the vendor who designed the customer service training modules for Delta. That included the auditing firm who reviewed incident resolution summaries. And when all of them realized their contracts were linked, they would talk. Alina wasn't interested in vengeance. She didn't want Megan fired. She didn't care if the gate agent cried or denied or forgot. What she wanted was for the system that empowered Megan's smirk to crack and for the silence around it to be turned into sound. 2 days later, the first fissure appeared. A confidential message came through from a compliance officer inside Delta's Boston branch. You're being discussed. They're trying to determine if you're connected to the university's freeze. Jordan raised an eyebrow when he saw it. They're beginning to understand, he said. But it was the second message that changed everything. It came from Callie, the young flight attendant from Charlotte. It wasn't addressed formally. It wasn't filed through HR. It was a direct email to Alina's academic address. No subject line. Just a few lines. I was there. I saw it happen. I didn't stop it. But I've seen it before. I can tell you what they say when they think no one's listening. If that helps, I'm sorry. It wasn't grand. It wasn't brave. But it was something. And it was the first time someone had said, I saw you. Alina stared at the message for a long time. Then she replied, Yes, that helps. Thank you for your courage. We'll speak soon. That same day, she sent a private calendar invite to her network of policy architects people she'd worked with at Harvard, Stanford, Chicago people, in positions of power, not because they demanded it, but because they earned it quietly, year after year. The meeting was simple. Subject: rethinking frontline ethics. Gate interaction protocols. No dramatic language, no references to personal experience. Just a topic that, until now, had never really been discussed in meaningful, actionable terms. But the invite list included names that made industry leaders tremble. And within 24 hours, it was accepted by all of them. Back in Charlotte, the fallout was beginning to percolate. Megan had noticed a change in tone. Her supervisor was terse. HR had suddenly scheduled a routine evaluation of gate performance. Whispers passed between agents, nothing loud, nothing confirmed, but enough to unsettle her rhythm. And when she opened her inbox and saw an anonymous complaint referencing conduct unbecoming of an access-level supervisor, she felt it. Not guilt, not yet. Just fear. Alina didn't watch the system squirm out of joy. She watched it because it was necessary. Because without friction, there would be no reform. Meanwhile, Callie had followed through. In a quietly scheduled call, she shared everything. The internal jokes agents made, the coding used to flag passengers who were deemed off-brand, and the way Megan had once called a well-dressed black man a seat risk after switching his upgraded seat back to basic economy because, quote, he made the section look inconsistent. Alina didn't interrupt her once. When the call ended, she sent Callie an encrypted message confirming her testimony would remain confidential. Callie responded simply, I'm just tired of watching it happen. So was Alina. That evening, sitting alone in her Boston office as snow dusted the windows, Alina reflected not on the strategy, not on the leverage, but on the moment on that cold vinyl seat in 33F. She remembered how small she had felt, how incredibly isolated, how it had taken every ounce of strength not to cry in front of strangers who wouldn't have cared if she did. But now, she wasn't alone anymore. She was building something, not just a response, but a framework, something others could use. Something that wouldn't just punish what had happened to her, but would prevent it from happening again. As the city lights flickered below, Alina drafted the first proposal for the Moore Standard, a cross-sector policy recommendation aimed at evaluating frontline customer service against real-time behavioral impact rather than internal satisfaction scores. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't marketable. but it would be hard to ignore, especially when the names backing it came from 5 of the most respected institutions in the country. This was how you change a system. Not with noise, with evidence, with resolve, with enough silence to gather what matters, and enough clarity to speak when the silence had run its course. And now, it had. The world didn't shift overnight. It never does. But something began to feel different in the days that followed. At first, it was in the tone of emails, subtle phrases that appeared in internal corporate messages. Under review, pending compliance input, recommended hold. Then came the reassignments, minor ones at first. A training supervisor rotated. A procedural audit moved up the calendar. A meeting canceled without explanation. Inside Delta's compliance wing, whispers rippled. The name Dr. Alina Moore began to pass between departments. Not with scandal, with caution. They didn't know the full scope. But they knew enough. She was connected, respected, and most dangerous quiet. She hadn't tweeted. She hadn't posted a statement. She hadn't called for boycotts or demanded heads roll. Instead, she had paused and moved with precision. Back in Cambridge, Alina stepped into her office wearing the same quiet expression she had worn at Gate B12. Composed, unreadable, yet unmistakably present. The space smelled like cedar and paper. Her assistant had left a note beside her desk. Callie's statement formally logged. She's requesting no press exposure. Wants to keep flying. Underneath, a scribble from Jordan. Integrity. Even when scared. That's who we protect. Alina read it twice, then folded the note and placed it into her drawer with care. She knew what that kind of bravery cost, especially when you didn't have power, especially when you were still learning how to use your voice. She remembered being that woman once, remembered whispering truths into a vacuum, hoping someone would hear. Now, she was the one others whispered to. The more standard draft circulated quietly that week. No press release, no launch party. Just a single PDF file, embedded in a faculty newsletter, linking to a framework that defined ethical treatment not by policy compliance, but by human impact. Within 48 hours, it had been downloaded 700 times. At Delta headquarters, a senior ethics officer flagged the document during an executive huddle. No one commented at first, until a VP of operations cleared her throat and asked, "Are we mentioned?" "No," the compliance lead answered. "But it doesn't need to. Because everything about the document, the examples, the breakdown of biases, the phrasing was familiar, too familiar. The more standard had turned their silence into case law." Meanwhile, Alina made no comment. She had already moved on to the next step, reform. She reached out not to media but to academia, not to lawyers but to educators. She began forming a panel, half public policy leaders, half frontline workers. She wanted both ends of the chain at the table. Wanted the gate agents and janitors and attendants who'd been told to smile through it for years, to speak without fear of reprimand. And slowly, they came. One by one, names started appearing on her schedule. Not just professors and deans, but staffers. A luggage handler from Minneapolis, a night shift gate agent from Phoenix, a customer service trainee from a Texas hub who said, "I read your name and felt like someone finally knew we weren't the problem, we were stuck inside one." Alina didn't cry during those meetings, but she did feel something shift inside her, the ache of isolation softening into the quiet strength of community. In those rooms, she didn't talk about Charlotte. She didn't need to. Instead, she asked, "What's one moment when the system told you your dignity didn't matter?" And they answered. And she listened. And she wrote. Meanwhile, the pressure at Delta mounted not from Alina's voice, but from the questions she left in her wake. An internal memo leaked brief, but telling, "Review all gate training SOPs. Cross-reference with Moore's framework. Ensure future upgrades are not vulnerable to implicit bias litigation. Quietly, discreetly. No external acknowledgement at this stage." Back in Charlotte, Megan Clifford sat in a meeting she hadn't expected to be called into. Her manager spoke carefully, referencing the situation at Gate B12 without naming names. HR reps present. A representative from legal listened but didn't speak. We're asking all customer-facing staff to revisit our DEI protocols, her supervisor said. Megan folded her arms. I followed policy. There was nothing. No one's accusing, the manager interrupted. But we're evolving our approach. It was meant to be neutral. But Megan felt the tremor, felt the quiet rebuke wrapped in professionalism, felt what Alina had felt days earlier, except this time it wasn't isolation. It was accountability. And it was gentle. That, Megan realized, was the most unsettling part. She had expected outrage, a call-out, maybe even public shaming. But instead, it was this invisible current pulling the floor from beneath her. Across the airport, Callie was attending a different meeting, this one, led by a regional ethics coordinator who had printed out the more standard, annotated it, and asked her if she'd like to join an internal review team forming in the coming weeks. You don't have to say yes, he said, but you saw something, and I think your voice matters. Callie nodded slowly. For the first time since Charlotte, she didn't feel like a coward. She felt responsible and alive. In Boston, Alina stood alone at a chalkboard, outlining revisions for the fall ethics curriculum. Her phone buzzed. It was Jordan. You've created something they can't ignore, and you did it without raising your voice once. She stared at the message for a long time, then typed back. That's the point. I wasn't silent. I was patient. That night, she returned home to a quiet apartment and made tea in the same mug she had used for 10 years, a gift from her first mentee, the one who used to call her Dr. Stillness. She had hated the nickname then. It made her sound distant. But now she understood. Stillness wasn't absence. It was presence, without apology. And now, with each policy shift, each confidential message, each young staffer reaching out not for protection, but for purpose or stillness, was becoming something bigger than protest. It was becoming practice. And that practice was beginning to change things in rooms she hadn't even entered yet. At Emory, faculty began revising onboarding protocols for adjuncts. At a national transportation summit, a panelist referenced the Moore Standard without even knowing she was in the audience. And in a private Zoom among Black women in executive roles, her name had become shorthand for a new kind of leadership. You're pulling a Moore. She moored the whole company. Keep it quiet, keep it clean, keep it Moore. Alina never corrected them. She didn't need to. Because real leadership isn't about who gets credit. It's about what happens when you don't need any. 2 months later, a brass plaque was quietly mounted outside a modest conference room on the 3rd floor of Emory University's Center for Applied Ethics. No ribbon cutting, no press release, just a simple inscription. The Alina Moore Room, for dignity, dialogue, and design. The room itself was small, 10 chairs, a large oak table, chalkboard on one wall, whiteboard on the other. Natural light streamed through tall windows. It wasn't grand, it was purposeful. Every week, students gathered there not just from ethics and policy, but from urban design, computer science, marketing, and frontline worker training programs. They sat together and studied one thing: how to build systems that make people feel seen. It had begun as an idea, then a document. Now it was space. Space with a name, yes, but more importantly, a mission. Dr. Alina Moore didn't ask for it. In fact, when she saw the email from the Board of Trustees notifying her of the naming decision, she hesitated before replying. For years, she had worked to remove herself from the center of the narrative. She believed deeply that the work should outlive its author. But that was exactly why the room mattered. It wasn't about honor. It was about memory. And memory, she knew, was the foundation of justice. Back in Charlotte, the atmosphere at Gate B12 had changed. Megan Clifford had completed 2 rounds of cultural competency workshops. Her demeanor had shifted subtly, but noticeably. She still smiled, still typed quickly, but the smirk was gone. The casual condescension had been replaced with something quieter, humility, perhaps, or understanding. She no longer dismissed passengers with unfamiliar accents, no longer reassigned seats without double-checking. And when a black woman in a tailored blazer approached the counter one morning confident, kind Megan met her eyes fully and said, "Welcome, ma'am. You're in 1A. Let me know if you need anything." The woman smiled, and Megan meant it when she smiled back. A small thing, but no small moment. Across the terminal, Callie stood beside the service board reading a revised memo, new seat reassignment policies, with built-in audit tracking and behavioral escalation protocols. She had helped write that memo. She had helped design the language. And when a supervisor thanked her quietly, she said, "It wasn't me. It was the woman who sat in silence and made the world listen anyway." Meanwhile, the Moore Standard had taken on a life of its own, not because it was viral, but because it was functional. Over 50 institutions had adopted it: airlines, universities, municipal departments, even tech companies. It wasn't legally binding. It didn't threaten lawsuits, but it made people pause, made people reconsider how they measured harm and how quickly they dismissed what didn't scream. Jordan once called it a scalpel disguised as a spreadsheet. And he was right. The work moved quietly through systems, cutting clean lines between habit and harm. Alina didn't oversee it directly anymore. She didn't need to. Others had picked it up, improved it, translated it. Her job was done not when people used her name, but when they no longer needed it to act with integrity. That was the real measure of legacy. She spent her days now mentoring, traveling occasionally, and guest lecturing at places that once made her feel like she didn't belong. She never spoke about Charlotte in public. She didn't have to. The echoes of that day lived in every changed policy, every shifted gaze, every young staffer who now asked, how would this make someone feel if no one else spoke up for them? One morning in Denver, she walked through an airport on her way to a community roundtable. A gate agent mid-30s, Latino, well-dressed, glanced at her boarding pass. Then his eyes widened slightly. "You're Dr. Moore." Alina raised an eyebrow. "I am." He smiled, but not nervously. "My supervisor made us study your framework. Said it was the first time someone explained how power can feel like silence. I didn't get it then. I think I do now." She smiled back. "Thank you." He nodded. "We're trying." Trying. That was enough. That was everything. A few weeks later, she received a package at her home. No return address, just a cream envelope inside, a handwritten card. "Dr. Moore, I wanted you to know that I've left Delta. Not because I was forced to, but because it was time. I'm now part of a nonprofit that supports anti-bias training across service industries. I never thanked you properly. I guess I didn't know how. You didn't raise your voice, but you raised mine, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to raise others. Respectfully, Callie." Alina held the card in her lap for a long while. Outside her window, the sky turned soft with morning. A robin landed on the railing, the kind of day no one would remember except maybe her. Because for her, it wasn't about headlines. It was about rooms. Quiet rooms. Rooms where dignity wasn't earned but presumed. Rooms where voices were invited, not tested. Rooms that bore no monuments but bore her name, and with it, a promise. That no one would ever again be asked to surrender their worth at the price of a seat. That no one would have to document their own dismissal in a notebook while the world rushed past. That silence would never again be mistaken for submission but recognized for what it could be. A waiting place. A breathing space. The calm before a different kind of storm. And when people sat down in that room at Emmer beneath the plaque in the sunlight, beside the oak table and the chalkboard, they wouldn't just be learning ethics. They'd be learning how to listen differently, and how to act before someone else had to. Because long after Alina Moore had stepped away, long after her name stopped appearing in inboxes and policy sheets and ethics symposiums, the room would still be there. Still quiet, still sacred, still full of the one thing every system forgets until it's too late. People remember how you made them feel. Have you ever found yourself in a moment so quiet, it hurt more than words ever could? A moment where you knew something was wrong, but no one around you seemed to notice or care? If you've ever sat in silence, not because you didn't have something to say, but because the weight of being dismissed was just too familiar then, you already understand the heart of this story. Dr. Alina Moore didn't fight back with noise. She responded with clarity, with purpose, and most of all, with dignity. And in doing so, she reminded us that silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes, it's the foundation of something far greater. So wherever you are right now, whether you're listening in your car, walking through your day, or sitting with your own story, you are not invisible. Your worth doesn't depend on the seat you're given, but on how you carry yourself when no one's watching. If this story moved you, I invite you to share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment below, tell us. Have you ever been there? Have you ever felt erased in a room you earned the right to be in? And if you believe in stories that honor quiet strength, that hold space for justice without rage, and that speak truth with stillness, then subscribe. Be part of this journey. We share voices like this because they don't always shout, but they always echo. Stillness isn't absence, it's presence without apology. I'll see you in the next story. Stay tuned.